You've probably heard someone say this phrase before: "This is the worst game I've ever played," and I'm sure at the time, that person fully believes what they had just said. However, if any of those people have ever played any of the games I'm about to talk about, they will know that they should never throw around that phrase lightly. Everyone, Zirin here. Today we're gonna delve into Kusoge, gaming's actual bottom of the barrel. Kusoge is a Japanese term that is a contraction of the words kuso and gameu, which respectively means and game. Putting it together, you get the term games. Kusoge are games that aren't just bad or not fun to play. They are games that are fundamentally broken in some way that just completely confounds the player. Sometimes they can be hard to the point of ridiculousness, and I don't mean like Dark Souls, where the difficulty is challenging but fair. I mean like enemies in the starting area one-shot you, and you're expected to grind slimes for 10 hours before moving on. Where many of the design decisions that players just take for granted as how games are meant to be played are completely absent. Or mechanics are put in that only seem to exist to torture the player for no good reason. What would normally be as simple as walking into a shop and buying an item instead becomes an hour-long process of alchemizing, or the game makes the overall movement take eons to progress, and then gives a run function only to penalize the player for using it. If any of that sounds too stupid to be true, just wait till the end and I'll cover some of them in a bit. Now, some of you may wonder, if these games are so fundamentally terrible and antagonistic to the player, why on earth would anyone want to play these kind of games? As someone who does enjoy their fair share of Kusoge, although probably not nearly as much as the true die-hard connoisseurs out there, I want to shed light on why some people might find them enjoyable. For one, I think by playing Kusoge, you can cultivate a much better appreciation for other games in general. A phrase I like to bring up is that you don't really know what you have until it's gone, and I think that directly applies to games. Many of the mechanics in the games we love, people tend to just take for granted that they should be there. In fact, they don't even notice it's there because the game designers out there have implemented them so naturally so as to make the gameplay feel good. To illustrate this point, I'm going to bring up the most obvious example that everyone has at least heard about: Super Mario Bros. On the NES. It's the most classic of games, but what is there to really talk about when it's like a 2-button game about moving from left to right? But if you look a bit deeper, there's actually a lot of design decisions that go into making the simple act of moving left to right feel so good to do in Mario. Momentum for one, where as you hold the B button, Mario starts to move faster and faster, and how that momentum carries over into when you jump, letting you go farther. Or the fact that the jumps are modular, and depending on how long you hold the A button for, you jump higher or lower. Or say the concept of Coyote Time. Taking its namesake from the old Warner Brother cartoons, Wile E. Coyote, it's the idea that for a split second before falling off a ledge, the player is given the opportunity to react and still jump. Without it, most players of Mario would probably die a ton more. Now you compare the technical marvel that is Mario to, say, a more unpolished product by a fledgling developer, and you'll quickly notice how bad a game can feel without many of these small features. Another reason I personally enjoy Kusoge is that I think some are very innovative. If there's one thing some Kusoge don't lack, it's ambition. It's just that many of these Kusoge don't have the technical prowess to back up the ideal they want to achieve for their game. This isn't the case for every single Kusoge, obviously. Some games are just plain bad due to mismanagement and just having a team that really didn't care. That said, I think there are many games where you can clearly see what the designers were going for, and that there are definitely some super interesting ideas in these games, whether it be from a storytelling or from a gameplay perspective. The problem just lies in the execution, where it's handled so ineptly and with such a loose grasp of how in the world to make a game, that it completely crumbles and the end result becomes atrociously bad. Finally, the last reason is just that Kusoge are really fun to me. The idea of discovering, playing, and sharing games that no one else will ever find out about to everyone out there, it's like being a gaming archaeologist. It also helps that I just like games that are so bad that it becomes magical in a way. When a game bugs out and I somehow manage to clip past the loading zone and then fall into an endless abyss, that's hilarious to me. It definitely takes a certain mindset to enjoy these kind of games. I'm not saying they're for everybody. However, I think regardless of whether or not you have that special something that helps you enjoy these kind of games, anyone can enjoy learning about them. It's like watching a train wreck, but an absolutely hilarious one where you can learn a lot from them as well. Even if you've never planned on playing one of these in your life, I still feel like it would be a lot of fun to just hear about mythical tales of games so bad that they become experiences. I've talked quite a bit about how Kusoges are not just bad, they are super bad, and I figured rather than just restating that point, let me instead show a couple of famous examples so I can highlight just how bad some Kusoges can get, and what I mean when I say they are fundamentally broken or completely inept. I'll give a brief description of each game and just a handful of the many issues each one has. If any of them catch your attention and you want to hear more about them, feel free to tell me down in the comment section below. Of course, if we're talking about Kusoges, we can't leave out the game that's infamous in the Japanese gaming world. A Kusoge so legendary that has been granted the informal title of Densetsu no Kusoge, or the legendary game. Is it the first bad game to ever exist? Probably not, but it is the most famous one. This game's title is Hoshi wo Miru Hito on the NES, roughly translating to people who view the stars, or stargazer for short. This game is a travesty in every single sense of the word. Everything about it is confoundingly bad. The easiest way to describe it is that it's a bad sci-fi clone of Dragon Quest, which came out just a year before. But even that barely does it justice. When you start the game, no opening cutscene, you are just immediately thrown onto the world map, which, to be completely fair, is how most NES RPGs did it, leaving the background story to the manual. Characters move through the overworld stupidly slow. The first town in the game is on the screen, but you can't see it because it's invisible. When you enter the second town in the game and you exit it, you get teleported back to the first town in the game because, I guess, later areas even just teleport you to random locations. Sometimes while walking through the overworld map, you'll just teleport back to the beginning of the game because teleporting traps are strewn randomly and invisibly throughout the overworld map. Just to spite you, hidden items are located on random panels alongside these teleporting traps, some of which are vital to completing the game. In fact, the overworld map itself looks so awful that it just hurts to look at. In battle, for whatever reason, characters only display the first digit of HP, so when it says 5 HP, it actually means 50 something, I guess. You can't run away from any battles in the game, except enemies can run away, and also, enemies in the starting area have a 1 in 4 chance of being unbeatable because you start at level 0. Even though it's a JRPG, they decided to have a password system instead of a battery save. A password system which doesn't even reliably save your information, where you can input the password saved and find out when you load it, you are lower level than you left off. There is a reason why this game is widely considered to be the legendary Kusoge. Everything about it is a mess and I only scratched the surface of it. I can't think of any redeeming quality, aside from the setup being a little interesting. The second Kusoge I want to talk about is Time and Eternity by Image Epoch, released on the PS3. Anyone remember this thing? When it came out back in 2012, everyone was hyped on how it was combining 2D animation with a 3D world seamlessly in action-packed combat where characters moved almost lifelike. Then when it came out, it got completely blasted. The art style seemed to hit that uncanny valley effect where it looked really off. The 2D animation felt stiff, it looked like the characters were merely drawn onto the 3D world as an afterthought. The 3D world itself was very uninspiring, especially since they reused a ton of generic backgrounds. Everything about the game, the cliché plot, the over-reliance on anime tropes rather than having actual characters, the gameplay loop that never really goes anywhere, all of it was done terribly. There are large and barren wastelands that stretch on endlessly that clearly was meant to fully display how beautiful and vibrant the world was, but instead is just a huge time slog for the player to get through. Time and Eternity is kind of what I mean when I say that some Kusoges don't lack ambition. This is a game that Image Epoch clearly envisioned as being their magnum opus, a super innovative game that will hook every single anime gaming fan. Unfortunately, the game is bad, and honestly, it's even bad looking. I wouldn't say it was cheap, because it looks like they had to dump quite a bit of money into the game. It's just that when everything was put together, it really didn't click. The battle system has potential. In theory, it's a wonderful mix of timing attacks and an active RPG system, where you have to react to your opponent's moves, constantly watching the opponent decide what moves to counter with. Problem was that, one, there was next to no enemy variety, so once you've seen a handful of enemies, you already know how all of them would act. Two, enemies telegraphed really obvious moves, so it was just a matter of pressing the right buttons at the right time. If the animation was just that much better, it could have been an amazing looking game. Unfortunately, we have time and eternity. The third Kusoge I want to bring up is one that I still think about to this day. A PC 88 game called Last Armageddon, although I played the slightly enhanced PC Engine CD version. This game was also on the NES, but that version is pretty different as in it's easier and worse, so I'll be focusing on the PC versions. Last Armageddon is another game that is widely known among the Japanese gaming community. With that said, unlike Hoshi wo Miruhito, this game is actually quite beloved. Now, as someone who did not grow up in Japan and is playing this game in current times, without nostalgia glasses, I would say that you'd have to be pretty cracked out to be able to beat this game without a guide. And even with a guide, it is still one of the hardest games I've ever played. There are some design decisions that are so cruel and player unfriendly that I have no idea how anyone put up with this nonsense back in the day. It makes wizardry look like a baby's game. It's a story-driven game with absolutely zero direction of where to go at any point. At the same time, this game has so many crazy ideas that I would consider innovative even if you were to view it in present-day context. I won't go into too much detail here since I plan on doing a video on its own, and just trying to describe it will be longer than this entire video. A quick example though, throughout the world there exist 108 lithographs, and you have to access every single one of them in order to progress to the second part of the game. Also, there's no indication of which lithograph you've already been to, so better bust out a piece of paper and start drawing a map to record it, I guess. The PC CD Engine version of the game thankfully lowered that restriction. Oh, while walking through the overworld, you randomly run into an earthquake which takes everyone to 1 HP, and then, after spending all your mana healing, you take one step and then you get hit by a tornado that again reduces your party HP to 1. Except now you're out of mana, so I guess you're screwed. At the same time, it has a crazy 3-party system that changes based on the calendar and time of day, which is a cool idea that completely doesn't work because of how the game functions. It has a sick 80s synth soundtrack and one of the catchiest battle themes I've ever heard of in any game. It has an incredibly nuanced story about humanity and stuff like twisting all the biblical stories to show the evil nature of humanity, like Noah being selfish by not informing his neighbors about the ark he's building. I can see why Last Armageddon is considered a masterpiece by some, but those people must also be battle-scarred veterans to be able to handle all the nonsense the game throws at you. The last Kusoge I'm going to mention is one that has actually received a sequel this year, Deadly Premonition in English, or Red Seed Profile in Japan. A game that's considered a cult classic, in the sense that you probably have to be in a cult in order to put up with how badly it plays. If some of you have checked out my Twitter, you would know that I'm just poking fun at it since I'm actually one of those who really love Deadly Premonition. It's a Xbox 360 game that when released had a shocking frame rate of like 15 FPS. It looked like it had come from the previous generation and just kinda got ported over. It's a game that from a sheer technical aspect is awful. What it more than makes up for, however, is with a completely surreal story that is a ripoff of Twin Peaks, but like 80% weirder and more quirky. No game, I think, fits the word quirky like Deadly Premonition. Swery is the head of the game, and if you know anything about him, you know his games are all experiences first, with the game side being more of an afterthought. Deadly Premonition controls like hot garbage, from the super long driving sections in between story events, to the actual combat which feels like Resident Evil 3 if the player was constantly trudging through a swampland. Luckily, I played the director's cut on the PS3, so instead it feels like Resident Evil 4 if the player was trudging through a swampland. Yet even during the awful driving, Francis York Morgan is always constantly talking to the player, I mean his imaginary friend Zach, about old 90s movies and albums, or when he's not, you know, doing coffee fortune telling. Technical pop-ins are everywhere, dogs fly from the sky onto the ground, you fight Ashura near the end. Deadly Premonition is a game that is worth a video all on its own, and I highly suggest anyone looking for a good time to just watch a playthrough of it. Or better yet, you have the ability to enjoy these kind of games, to even play it yourself. Before I wrap this up, I want to give a little shout out to hardcoregaming101.net. They're one of the very few websites that have information on some of the most obscure games out there, and without them, I doubt I would have ever come across Hoshi wo Miruhito. Anyways, the biggest thing I want to show about this list, aside from describing how bad some of these Kusoges can get, is the idea that Kusoges are not just really bad old games. Kusoges are still being made to this day. I will say you do see them less frequently nowadays as opposed to way back in the past. Unlike the Wild West of video game making back in the day, where anyone was trying to create a game entirely from scratch, these days there are plenty of engines and tools that can greatly aid even incredibly small studios into making great games. The internet makes for a much easier access as well to get others to test your game you plan on making before releasing it to the public. That said, with the right, more like wrong circumstances I guess, you can still come out with some beautifully broken games that are all perfect candidates for the Kusoge title. Another fact that I want to hone in on is that Kusoge is a term, an idea. There is no one list that exists that has every Kusoge ever made on it. What people consider Kusoge is based entirely on personal perspective. While there are some games like Hoshi wo Miruhito or Superman 64 that everyone considers to be a absolute dumpster fire, most of the time it's debatable. It's just that for bad games, it's usually a lot easier for everyone to agree with something being so ridiculously terrible, as opposed to whether something is a kamige or best game ever. Luckily for everyone here, when I say Kusoge, you usually can infer that the game I'm going to talk about is probably going to be pretty dang bad. At the same time, however, those games are probably going to be really interesting as well because I tend to skip over all the boring bad Kusoges, whether that be from the hidden passion of the developers or tons of innovative ideas buried beneath terrible execution. If you've got any Kusoges that you want to share, or you want me to talk about any more of the games I just mentioned, feel free to tell me down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this fascinating look at a small subsection of games that I am passionate about, the like button is down below, subscribe if you want to support the channel, notification and all buttons to get notified on when the next video comes out, and I do have a Twitter at ZeronVN, which I occasionally post on. And that will be it for me. I'll see you later, till next time.